I'm on. You can turn me up, maybe. The intertestamental period. All right, you guys, come on in. Come on in. The 400 silent years, as we call them. Not so silent, really, but God wasn't speaking during that time. And that's why they're called that. Here's the slide that I'm putting up in every class. God is in control, whether we see it or not, then and now. Last week we were looking at Daniel 8, which is the vision of the ram and the goat, which showed how Persia was taken down by the Greeks, specifically by King Alexander the Great, and then how his kingdom was split up among several of his generals, of which one, Antiochus IV, was a really bad guy. We'll talk about him again today. And then, of course, when we get to the Seleucids. We talked about Daniel 9, 24, 27, the 70 weeks prophecy. I don't know how anybody can say that Jesus did not accomplish what is said in verse 24. I won't read that today. But there are people out there, I heard someone on the radio yesterday saying that this was not accomplished in Jesus' time, only when he comes back and there's an Antichrist and all those things that they say. And this person even said that God in heaven is laughing at those of us who believed it was accomplished at that time. No comment. Daniel 11:12, I told you about my reservations about chapter 12, about how difficult it is to interpret, although I'm not sure I'm here to interpret everything that's in Daniel. But it is a difficult passage, chapter 12. We started looking at 11 and some of the accomplishments in history of the predictions in Daniel 11. We started by looking at this screen. I underlined the most important part. I put this up because so many people say that Daniel 11 is so specific that he must have written afterwards, like in the 200s. But this person, this is David Schrock, who's saying, those who believe God inspired the Word of God have little trouble letting the text speak. Scripture teaches us that God has declared the end from the beginning and that nothing occurs by accident. We all believe that, I'm sure. Then we looked at several predictions concerning the king Xerxes I, Alexander the Great, Seleucid I, and this is where we were when we finished. We were looking at the accomplishment of this passage in verse 6 that had to do with Berenice and Laodice. I have the same problem. Where's Art? We have the same problem with pronouncing these names. You can look up these names online, pronounce this name, and you get 3 different pronunciations for the same name. That's what you ran into. That's what I've run into all the time. Anyway, Berenice and Laodice. Here's what I had up there, but I found it was a little bit fuzzy in this explanation. So I just made a chart to make this a little bit simpler, the accomplishment of this prophecy. Ptolemy II was the king of Egypt. Antiochus III up in Syria. Ptolemy II had a daughter. Her name was Berenice. Antiochus had a wife named Laodice. These 2 guys got together and decided that Antiochus should marry Berenice and get rid of his wife, Laodice. So he did that. That's not really lined up, but anyway, he did that. Laodice didn't like being put away. So when Ptolemy II died, she convinced Antiochus to take her back, which he did. But then we find out that she was directly responsible for the death of Berenice, for Berenice's son, for his servants, and even possibly for her father, Ptolemy II, which would mean that that's where she began, because he died before all these other people did. So, if history is correct on that point, she probably wiped out the whole family because she was put away and didn't want to be put away and shouldn't have been put away. Okay, there are several more of these, but we're going to move quickly through them. I'll concentrate mostly on the interpretation of the prophecy, not so much on how the prophecy is stated. I want to show that Israel suffered a lot from the back and forth between the Seleucids in the north, they were the kings of the north, and the Ptolemies in the south, they were the kings of the south. So, we said that Berenice was, Berenice. No. What's her name? Already forgotten. Yeah, it's Berenice. She's the one who was killed, and her brother came and avenged her killing. He went up into Syria, Palestine, and took Jerusalem, along with a bunch of other areas up there. So the Jews were in the middle of that. So then, Seleucus III and Antiochus III, who were sons of Seleucus II, they came back and they retook Jerusalem. And then, Antiochus III was defeated by Ptolemy IV, who then took back the Holy Land. So what we have is two major powers of the time, and the Jews are sitting right between them, and they're going back and forth over a period of several decades here. They're going back and forth, reconquering each other, and the Jews have to be crossed. I mean, they have to go through their territory every time, and they get taken by one power and taken to the other, and they have trouble deciding whom to side with. You know, when it's Seleucus coming through, you know, you sort of want to be on his side. And when it's Antiochus coming through, or Ptolemy coming through, you sort of want to be on his side. Otherwise, you know, there's a lot of danger and a lot of damage that is created. All right, so let's see where we are here. Okay. Here's another back and forth. Antiochus invaded Egypt. He went down to Egypt and took it again, and he also retook Palestine. That was in 200. Keep that date in mind, 200. Some say 198, but 200. So the Jews living in Palestine helped Antiochus III because they resented the rule of the Ptolemies. Ptolemy III, when he had come in to take over Israel, he had taken a bunch of slaves away down to Egypt. The Jews didn't like that, of course, and so they hopped on the side of Antiochus. But then Antiochus, when he came back from Egypt, came into Israel, and he punished a lot of those Jews that were on his side, weren't on his side when he came in the time before, so that created a problem. And then from that point on, as he took Palestine in 200, the Seleucids held Judea until it was taken over by the Romans in 64. Even during the time of the Maccabean revolt, they were still subject, ultimately, to the Seleucid dynasty. And then the Hasmoneans, who came in and established their own little kingdom, were never completely independent. They still were dependent upon the Seleucids. One more of these, I think. Antiochus III gave his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V of Egypt. This is not the Cleopatra of renown. She didn't come in until about 100 years later. But that was another effort to kind of take over on the part of Antiochus. All right, so Antiochus III, who is now in control of Judea, turns to the north and the west, and he tries to go up toward Asia Minor and Greece. And he is defeated by the Romans in 190, I have it up there and can't read it, 191 and 189. The Romans are already that powerful in 200 years before they actually took over the region completely. They were defeating these guys. So Antiochus III was pushed back by the Romans, and then he needed money, so he started going around the kingdom pillaging the temples, and then somehow or other somebody caught him at it, and a crowd gathered in Babylon, and he was killed. All right, so then his oldest son took the throne, and he was going to tax the Jews. He knew his dad needed money. He needed money. His dad was gone, so he was going to be in charge of getting the money. He was going to get it from the Jews. But he didn't live very long. He fell from a horse and died, except that was the official story. The unofficial story was that Antiochus IV, his brother, probably just got rid of him because Antiochus IV was rising in power. So we have now a long passage in Daniel 11 about Antiochus IV that I'm not going to read now, because we'll talk about that at length when we get to the Seleucids and talk about what he did to the Jews. The history says that he assumed the throne by intrigue. He flattered everybody that he didn't kill, and he gained vital assistance in this way. And then he took the name Epiphanes, which means illustrious. Antiochus IV the Illustrious. In the passage that I'm not reading right now, 11 to 35, there is a reference, although small, to the Maccabean revolt. In verses 32 and 33, he, that's Antiochus IV, shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action, and the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. I think that's a reference, pretty direct, to the efforts of the Maccabeans to throw off the Seleucid power. Then we have 36 to 45, which in the major Christian non-Catholic churches of today, it's considered to apply to the end of time for some strange reason, as I was referring to a while ago. Now, I don't think, this is my own remark here in the bottom, chronologically and logically, this should apply to the Seleucids or to the succession of the Seleucids or to the Hasmoneans or the Romans in maybe some way or other, to all of them. But there's no reason to stop here and cut in the middle of this passage and then talk about 2,000 years or maybe more down the line. This to me is describing what was happening at the end of the Antiochus IV passage in verse 35. I might point out that Antiochus IV will rule. I say will because we're not to his reign yet, but he will rule between 175 and 164. And that leaves 100 more years of Seleucid reign over the Jews before the Romans come in and take over everything. And that makes, I counted them, I have the list right here, 21 or 22, I forget. 21 or 22 more Seleucid kings are going to reign over Judea before the Romans take over in 64. There's a bunch more Antiochuses. They go clear up to 13, Antiochus 13. And then there are some Philips and some Tigranes and some there's another one here. Alexander, Demetrius. There's all kinds of Seleucid kings that reign clear up to the takeover by the Romans. The last one to rule over Judea was called Philip II Philorameus. At least that's the way I think it's pronounced. And he was killed by the Romans, 65 BC. Okay, so when we get to the words, the time of the end, at the end of this prophecy, in verse 40, as I was saying a minute ago, I really think that applies to the end of this prophecy, the end of this period of time, not necessarily to the end of time. We have to remember that Rome has been the end of these prophecies all the way through Daniel, and Rome was definitely rising when the Seleucids were falling away. Okay, what I've tried to show you in this section, which has been longer than I expected for it to be, is that the whole 400-year period was prophesied by Daniel several hundred years before most of these things occurred. And the time of the end, then, is the end of his prophecy, in my view. And we're going to stop there and start on the Persian period, and I'll just take a pause and ask if there are any questions or remarks to make in the room. There's a microphone available. Quick question, John.
Probably not quick. Can you remind me of who the Hasmoneans?
The Hasmoneans are the descendants of the Maccabeans, and the Maccabean revolt came in, and they were successful for a while. We'll see that between 167 and I forget what the date of the end is. And the descendants of them then formed a kingdom, and they were the Hasmoneans. So they're connected, the Maccabeans and the Hasmoneans. But that's in like 200 and 100s before Jesus. We're not there yet, but we will, I hope, get there. All right, so let's talk about, there's that slide that comes in every one of our sections. the Persian period. In this period, besides a little bit of history, I'm going to try to talk to you a little bit about the Samaritans, about the synagogues. We won't spend a lot of time on the synagogues because Michael did an excellent job talking about those things when he was talking about the development of the Bible. We're going to talk about an actual murder that took place in the temple in Jerusalem during this time, and a colony of Jews who lived and worked and worshipped in Elephantine, in Egypt. Okay, here's a map of the Persian Empire when it was at its greatest. When we see Alexander's empire, it's essentially going to be the same, although it'll be controlled by the Greeks by that time. The Persian Empire is the Achaemenid Empire because Cyrus Cyrus II, who is the Cyrus who sent the Jews back to Jerusalem, actually went to war against his grandfather, who was an Achaemenid, descended from some kind of a warlord, Achaemenid, way back in 7th century. So then he established what is called the Achaemenid Empire, or the Persian Empire. We'll probably stick with Persian. Here's the chart of the kings that rule in the Persian period. And from this chart, we can see that the intertestamental period began right about here. Malachi was probably prophesying right in here. So the Jews had been under the Persians for several decades, over 100 years, by the time the Old Testament finished, and they were going to be under it, for another 90-ish years. Now, you'll notice that there are several Dariuses, there are several Xerxes, well, there's more than one Darius, or Darius, if you want. More than one Xerxes, more than one Artaxerxes, and the history people who talk about these guys don't always identify which one they're talking about. Boy, that's confusing. Yeah, Mike goes, yeah. It is confusing when you try to figure it out. And even when you get the right one between two historians, they don't always agree on the dates. So these are the dates as I put them up because those are the ones that seem to be just about what these kings had. Now, I've come up with a system for saying the names. I think you'll appreciate this. Xerxes, by the way, Xerxes is not too hard in English. Xerxes. In French, it's Xerxes. Xerxes. So I appreciate it. In English, it's easier. But let's just call him Circle 6. Isn't that easier? Artaxerxes, we can call Arctic Circle 6. I knew you'd appreciate these. Darius, that's not too difficult, so that's easy enough. We'll go to the next one. Antiochus, we can say Andicus or Antiochus. Now, I put Nebuchadnezzar up. We're done with him, essentially. But I put him up there because, nevertheless is pretty good. Never say never. Never say, not nevertheless. Never say never. And then Cambyses, we can say come by these. That's just kidding, of course, but it's to make the point that Art was making last Wednesday. The names, the pronunciation of the names is not always the same, and we're going to have names a whole lot more complicated than these as we go along. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about some of these guys and what was going on then in the courts, mostly in the courts, during the time that the Jews were under the baton of the Persians. Cyrus II the Great is the one who sent them back to Jerusalem, right? Cambyses was his son. He went down to Egypt and became a pharaoh. 27th empire, or the 27th dynasty in Egypt. Darius, or Darius the First, is also called the Great, but I didn't put that up there. There's so many greats, they're all great, these guys. Darius the Great was probably, I think, the Darius of Daniel. That would make Daniel a very old man, but and the historians are not agreed on whether that's true or not, but this Darius probably killed a pretender to the throne. And he was ruling when the temple in Jerusalem was completed in 515. Xerxes the Great was Esther's husband, you remember that. He was trying to dominate Greece. Greece, it didn't work. He succeeded in burning Athens, but he did not dominate the Greeks. The Greeks were really tough. They were really hard to dominate. Artaxerxes the First was Xerxes' stepson, and so therefore by marriage Esther's stepson. He was a nicer guy, I think, than his father. By the way, Xerxes the Great was assassinated by a bodyguard. Cyrus II died in battle, and Cambyses too, I think. Not sure about Darius I, but Xerxes the Great was assassinated. And that happened a lot, as we will see. Artaxerxes I then died a natural death, kind of unusual for somebody in that time. Xerxes II, by the way, Artaxerxes I is the one who sent Nehemiah back to Jerusalem. Actually, he sent Ezra and Nehemiah. Xerxes II, oh, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to go on yet. Xerxes II only lasted 45 days, and he was assassinated. Darius II was, we're beginning now in the period between the testaments. Darius II was a very indecisive man, so there's not a lot known about him. So now we get to Artaxerxes and Artaxerxes II, III, IV, and Darius III. So, okay, let's look at Artaxerxes II. By the way, keep Darius II in mind. We're going to talk about him a little bit more. Artaxerxes II was the first of the Persian kings to send out all over his kingdom images of his own gods, especially this one, Anahita, goddess of water. Now, history says that he sent them out all over the kingdom, which I would assume that would mean in Judea. I looked for, but couldn't find any kind of indication about how the Jews took this, having this idol put up all over everywhere. Apparently, he didn't require them to worship this idol, but he had to put up everywhere. By the way, if you see this in a thrift store, buy it. That's an old thing. That's a really old thing. Anyway, Artaxerxes II is said to have had 115 sons with 350 wives. That's going to be important here in a minute. 115 sons, didn't mention the daughters. Probably that many daughters as well. 350 wives. Okay, hold on to that then. Then Artaxerxes III comes in. Now remember, these are the people ruling over the Jews during the time between the Testaments. All right? Artaxerxes III was called Ochus, O-C-H-U-S. But since there were 115 sons, how did they decide which one was going to be the next Artaxerxes? Well, easy. For Artaxerxes III, he had the others killed, all of them. The boys and the girls. Now, he must have had some kind of help from the military arm of the former king. But he had them all eliminated so that he could be king. That doesn't happen in the Bible, right? Actually, it did once, right? 70 of his brothers were killed by Abimelech so he could be judge in Israel. That's just an aside. They called this guy the donkey because he was evil, and the donkey was dedicated to the god of evil. Then Artaxerxes III was followed normally by Artaxerxes IV, Artaxerxes, and his personal name was Arses. I won't spell that out for you. It's a little embarrassing. Arses. Now, all right, let me tell you a story. This is probably boring to you, so let me tell you a story that will maybe interest you a little bit more. We go back to Artaxerxes II. He had a vizier, a kind of a prime minister, whose name was Bogoas. This guy, all the old kings had a guy like this, who essentially ran the country. Consulted the king, obviously, who made the ultimate decisions, but this guy ran the country, right? This Bagoas was, or Bagoses or Bagosi, was a dangerous man because he was the true power during Artaxerxes II's reign. During this time, Greece was trying to rise against Persia. Bagoas knew that there were factions in Greece, especially in the Spartans and the Athens, who couldn't get along. And therefore, they couldn't get united against Persia. So the longer they argued, the longer it would take Greece to attack Persia. So what he did was he financed the Athenians and he financed the Spartans to fight against each other. But somewhere along the line, Artaxerxes II fell out of favor with Bagoas. So what did he do? He got rid of him. He poisoned him. and he became the chief minister of Artaxerxes III. Now remember that I said that Artaxerxes III killed all of his brothers and sisters. Well, the historians think it was Bagoas who did that, took care of it for him, and set up his son to be the king. All right, let's see now. Not his son. I mean, he set up Artaxerxes III to become the king. Okay, then when Artaxerxes III fell out of favor with this powerful man, he got rid of him too. And he set up Artaxerxes IV, Arces. Now, Artaxerxes IV was a weak man. There were revolts in the kingdom, and he wasn't very good at setting them down. So what happened to him? Well, he got rid of him too. This guy just is a serial poisoner, right? He got rid of him. And there was a cousin of Artaxerxes IV, whose name was Artacetam, a great warrior who was in the army, the king's army way up north in Armenia. And he was called back by Bagoas to take the throne. Actually, this cousin had already said to Bagoas, you need to get rid of Artaxerxes IV. He's not doing a good job. So Darius III, Artacetam became Darius III, the next king of Persia. He came to his throne the same year that Alexander the Great came to his, 336. This guy was smart. This guy was brave. He was a soldier. He could look around him and see what was happening, and he knew to be careful about Bagoas. And so, here's the rest of the story about what happened to Bagoas. It's told by Diodorus. This is a guy who invented underarm, I think. Diodorus of Sicily, 1st century. As to Bagoas, an odd thing happened to him, and one to point a moral. Pursuing his habitual savagery, he attempted to remove Darius III by poison. The plan leaked out, however, and the king, calling upon Bagoas, as it were, to drink to him a toast, and handing him his own cup, the king's cup, compelled him to take his own medicine. So there's what happened to Bagoas. After a long period, 20 or so years, where he was just getting rid of the kings he didn't like, he finally met his match in Darius III. Darius III will be the king that Alexander the Great will conquer then in 331 or 330-ish, about that time. Okay, what about the Jews during this time, while they were under Persia? Under the Persian kings, the Jews were relatively tranquil, relatively at peace. They treated them really not too bad, actually. They belonged to one of the satrapies. There were 23 satrapies, and one of them included Judah, was called Arabia. Okay? Now this satrap, there was a satrap in every one of the satrapies, and there was one in Judah all the time. And this is supposedly a carving about the satrap doing judgment, judging the people. Because he had the power of judgment. He had all the power of the king in the province. He had a palace, he had a harem, he had bodyguards, he had the power of life and death over his subjects. But he was always accompanied by a secretary who represented the king. And this secretary was always watching this satrap to make sure he was being fair and that he was doing his job. And every year the king sent an inspector to talk to this secretary. And if the secretary said he's doing a lousy job, he was executed and replaced, especially if it could be proven that he had accepted bribes or was partial in any way. Now, as I was studying for this part, I didn't find this there. I had already seen this somewhere in my readings years ago, that Persian judges, if they were considered to have committed the crime of accepting bribes or of being partial, they were executed, and their skin was used to cover the seat of the next judge. Now, brethren, that looks like that to me. See that thing up there? See that? That looks like a skin hanging off his chair. So I don't know if that's what that is, but to me that says, maybe that's the way it was exactly. So anyway, it appears from history that the Persian satraps who lived in Jerusalem as I said, remained relatively tolerant of the Jews. Relatively tolerant. So now, let's talk about the Samaritans. We all know that in 722, when the Assyrians came in and took the northern kingdoms, they didn't take everybody. They left some people in Jerusalem or in Judea. When the Babylonians came in, 607, 586, they did the same. Took some out, left some in. And then the Persians and the Babylonians also sent people from other places into Judea. So what we got was a mix, a terrible mix, a mix of people who weren't really Hebrew, but who weren't really Gentiles either. They just were nothing on either side of that equation. So here's what our French author says about this. The most important religious event to take place under the Persian rule is the building of the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim at the doors of Shechem. Okay, stop there. There was so much dissension in Jerusalem that those people called Samaritans, and they were so disliked, they left Jerusalem. They went up to Gerizim, and they sort of set up their own system, including their own temple. We'll talk a little bit more about that. All the Samaritans remaining from the first returns after the exile, accompanied by a group of Jews who wished to escape the rigor of the restoration by Ezra, celebrated there a reduced form of temple worship. The immigrants from Jerusalem brought with them the Pentateuch, which they had made their only holy scriptures. Michael pointed this out while he was talking about the development of the Bible, thus creating a sort of hybrid Judaism that caused a very heated animosity in the heart of their brothers in the holy city. So the Samaritans accepted only the Pentateuch, only the first 5 books of the Bible, and they had their own unique system of worship, and they built this temple on Gerizim. Josephus says the Gerizim temple was built after the model of the sanctuary in Jerusalem. And I looked it up just yesterday, the day before. Remember when Israel was coming out of Egypt, and Moses lined them up on 2 mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And on one side they were saying the curses, and one side they were saying the blessings. Guess which mountain was the blessings? It was Gerizim. I think that's why they picked that mountain, to go up there and build that temple. I have no way of knowing, but that just makes sense to me, that they would go onto the Mount of Blessing to build their temple up there. This temple was destroyed. By the way, when I show it here, where did I show it? Here? Yeah. This is not broken down from old age. It was destroyed in about 110 BC by John Hyrcanus, one of the Hasmoneans. We'll talk about that when the time comes. The temple site there was considered sacred by the Samaritans at the time, and is still considered sacred by the Samaritans who do. There are still some Samaritans in Jerusalem today who still consider the site of Gerizim a sacred place. When Jesus talked to the woman at the well in John 4, the temple had been destroyed for over 100 years, and you still see how the animosity, and several other passages in the New Testament indicate there was a large animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews. Maybe I have another picture, yeah, of the destroyed temple. You know, it's sort of there, but it's destroyed. All right, let's talk about the synagogues. I'll be relatively brief, because we've already talked about that. They essentially began during the Babylonian captivity, but during the Persian, I might say Syrian instead of Persian. If I do, raise your hand and correct me. During the Persian occupation, they really developed, and there was no temple, you see, for all the people who weren't in Jerusalem. So all over the kingdom of Persia, there were synagogues where people could go, because they couldn't go to the temple in Jerusalem. The temple had been a focal point, but it had been destroyed, of course, by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, I was surprised to find out that in the synagogues, even today, they have Orthodox synagogues, conservative synagogues, liberal synagogues, and Reform synagogues. What's that sound like? Sounds like the current religious Christian atmosphere. You know, they have the same divisions that exist in Christian, so-called Christian theology. The Hebrew word for synagogue is knesset, which is the word for the parliament. The modern state of Israel has a parliament called Knesset. Okay, and Michael pointed this out, that you need a quorum of 10 heads of families to be considered necessary. That was necessary to organize a synagogue in the city. And the word synagogue stands at the same time for the local congregation and for the building or the place. According to Milton, okay, anyway, that's an old run-down synagogue, ancient. Milton Steinberg says they were three things. They were a public worship, a house of public worship, a school, and sort of just like a meeting place for people to go to and to get together and do things. We know that the first thing that the exiles wanted to do when they came back was build a temple. But if they weren't in Jerusalem, they couldn't build a temple, because Jerusalem was the only place where it was accepted that a temple be constructed. Except that, as we will see, some of the Jews built their own temple, and the Samaritans had built theirs too. Quickly, here's a floor plan. And I want to just point out a couple of things. This was a general floor plan of any synagogue, even today, although the seating arrangements will be different. There was always the ark right here, which was where the sacred writings were kept, the rolls of Scripture. And then there was a kind of a plateau, a speaking place, what would you call it, a podium here, where anybody who was reading the scrolls would stand. And when they taught, they would sit. But when they read the scrolls, they would stand. That's probably why Jesus in Luke 4, when he reads Isaiah 61, he reads from the Scripture from this central platform. And then he sits down to tell them, today this prophecy of the Scripture has been fulfilled. Okay. The worship services of the synagogue enjoyed great freedom. Any competent Israelite could participate, and the liberty which was accorded, the Apostle Paul is an illustration when he says, from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. The synagogues exist, of course, still today among the Jewish people, and they go to them regularly. As a rule, they all face Jerusalem. Now, let me show you some pictures of modern-day synagogues. They can be pretty fancy, see? Pretty fancy. But they still have the ark in the front, the speaking podium, and usually they have, I didn't mention this, but they usually have a light up there by the ark that is kept burning all the time in relation to the sort of like the light in the temple. The most important, or not the most important, the most well-known, the best-known one is probably this one. What's that look like? A boat with sails? Sort of. Designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, whom you'll recognize as a great architect. It's in Pennsylvania somewhere. And here is the inside of that. So to me, these look sort of like some large Christian church buildings, sort of. But they do have a unique kind of flavor that is Jewish. Okay. Now, the bell's going to ring in 1 minute, then we have 5. So I think I won't talk about the murder in the temple, which I was surprised to find out about. And I think you'll be surprised to find out there was an actual murder in the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, Lance, could you switch me over to, or David, to the word common? And I'll find my notes. We're clear we're going to leave all this stuff right now, and we'll be back to it next week. Okay. Now, this one isn't really funny. Not all these are funny. The first couple seem to be, but this is an interesting thing that I fell upon, and maybe some of this you've already seen, probably you have. These are common English phrases taken from the Bible. People use these phrases all the time, even non-Christians, even atheists, without realizing that they come from the Bible. Some of them are more obvious than others. Take, for example, flesh and bone. That's when Adam says, this is my flesh, this is my bone. when he sees Eve. My brother's keeper, of course, is Cain. Am I my brother's keeper? The land flowing with milk and honey is Canaan, described by God to Israel. An eye for an eye, which is the lex talionis, which is the law, which means law of retaliation, which was given to the judges in Israel. It wasn't a license to take revenge. It was a word of precaution to the judges to make sure that no punishment exceeded the gravity of the crime. That's what that was all about. The apple of his eye, Deuteronomy 32, those are the words of Moses, and he says, Jacob is the apple of God's eye. Jacob, Israel. The rod of iron, you shall break with them with a rod of iron. Kings who conspire against the Lord shall be broken with the rod of iron. This is probably the most familiar one, my cup runs over, David in Psalm 23. Let me tell you something about the balm in Gilead. Jeremiah says he's lamenting the things that are happening in Jerusalem about the time the Babylonians are coming in. And he says there's no balm in Gilead, nothing to soothe us. And there's a history behind that, I think, but I didn't get into that. I remember years ago the Harding Chorus came to Europe to sing. And they had learned the song, There is a balm in Gilead. You know that song? Okay, they weren't allowed to sing it when they got to Israel, because there had been some terrorism going on, and balm sounds like bomb, so they couldn't sing There's a Balm in Israel or in Gilead. So they had to cut that song out. I thought that was an interesting little anecdote. Anyway, I'm sorry, the salt, I skipped some, didn't I? Handwriting on the wall, that's Belshazzar, when he was getting ready to, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting, what the hand was writing there. The salt of the earth, this is an expression of Jesus. You are the salt of the earth. No man can serve two masters. Again, that's Jesus. The straight and narrow refers to the straight path that goes to life and narrow path that goes to life, whereas there's a large one that goes to death. I know one of my brothers uses that expression in his prayers often. Keep us on the straight and narrow. The brother who's in this room today will recognize himself. The wolf in sheep's clothing, obviously, is the false messiahs that Jesus talks about. Blood money is Judas's money, his 30 pieces of silver. Physician, heal thyself is Jesus quoting a proverb that existed already. This is not Jesus coming up with something which he did all the time. This time he was quoting a proverb that existed among the Jews already. Physician, heal yourself. If you can help other people, you can help yourself. Right? Eat, drink, and be merry. I thought right away this was Paul, but it wasn't. Paul says eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. But this is the guy who had the great harvest and wanted to build more barns. Say to your soul, eat, drink, and be merry. That's what that's all about. The truth shall make you free. Sorry about that. Jesus saying to the Pharisees, by the way, I noticed in this passage that he says this to those who believe in him. Usually in John 8, we think that he's criticizing those who don't, who are attacking him. He's actually talking to his believers, his disciples there, among the Pharisees. And he says to them, the truth will make you free. Paul refers to the Galatians who are fallen from grace because they want to go back to the old law. And then, what is the root of all evil? Everybody, that's the trap question we always ask. What is the root of all evil? The love of money. Not money, the love of money. And we use all these expressions. People use them all the time. They come from the Bible, and you can make a pretty good case for the Bible outside of what its religious message is, making a very large impact on our culture in the West today. All right, we are 9:44, so you have an extra minute. Thanks for your attention, and we'll see you again in a few minutes.